Hello and welcome again to Secrets of Meaning, the podcast arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Edras. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. Just a reminder, please check us out on the website, jewishsacredaging.com. If you'd like to make a suggestion or comment, please just feel free to email me, rabbiadress@jewishsacredaging.com. One of the most exciting, interesting, challenging, and to some people concerning issues that we're dealing with right now in our life stage and our longevity is the impact of some technology on us. And one of those aspects of technology has to do with the field of genetics. And we are very, very pleased to welcome to the microphone to Seekers of Meaning today, Dr. Andrew Mulberg, who's a pediatric gastroenterologist and a rare disease drug developer. It's a lot to fit on the t-shirt. Full disclosure, Rabbi Mulberg and I were at a conference that we both attended in late January. And we got to talking about some of the issues that came up at the conference. And he was beginning to tell me about some of his work. And I decided that would be a really interesting conversation to have because the impact of frontier technologies is already affecting our generation and will continue to be developing. So, Dr. Mulberg, thank you very, very much. Yes, it's great to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Could you just walk me through I'm going to assume that some people who may be watching or listening to this may not have taken that class in developmental introduction to DNA 101. Walk me through that, if you would, very briefly. What is the genetic code? What's our DNA, and how important is it?
Sure. The genetic code, which defines us as human beings or as any other species, is referred to as deoxyribonucleic acid, obviously identified decades ago by Watson and Crick as a helical structure of basically four different chemicals referred to as nucleotides, which basically in combination and in sequence define each of us with our own specific traits, blue eyes or brown hair or any other clinical feature, also the propensity to develop disease. And DNA is so important and most recently has been revolutionized to the development of a very important vaccine in 2020, referred to as the COVID vaccine, based upon when DNA is processed in the body, it converts to something called RNA, which is ribonucleic acid, which is then what's called translated into protein. Proteins are what create the messenger for us to be able to carry out function, affect structure, and therefore affect human disease or health.
So if I remember correctly, and please correct me because I'll probably be wrong, the Watson-Crick discovery of the double helix,
yes,
in the 1950s.
1950s, that's right.
Okay. And I'm going to stop at Jeopardy for that. And if I also remember correctly, here's a shot in the dark. In the literature, there are four letters that are CATG. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So we're now able to take these letters, for the want of a better term, and manipulate them. Is that correct?
That is correct. And that's the basis for what happens in something referred to as CRISPR technology, because CRISPR, which stands for a complicated term referred to as clustered, regularly interspaced, short palindromic repeats. And please don't ask me to repeat that.
I'm not, believe me.
But allows scientists to utilize that sequence of the DNA to manipulate and therefore correct defective DNA sequences in patients. And this has been revolutionized for the development of treatment for sickle cell disease within the past couple of years, and expected to be a important way to manipulate everything from in utero, when fetuses are developing, potentially to all ages, where we can identify the relationship of an abnormal DNA to disease. And that's a big leap.
So that leads me to a question: is that which is right out of, I guess, for some people will say science fiction. You're saying it is now possible that to manipulate the genetic code of a human being by restructuring their DNA, and you can even do, you can even do that in utero. Is that what I'm hearing correct?
Yeah. So what I'm talking about is the panorama of what's potentially feasible. There are scientists in California at one of the University of California schools who are doing fetal manipulation to try to correct inborn errors of metabolism. And I'm sure there are other scientists working on the other end of the age spectrum, potentially. I think that what's amazing is that CRISPR is not the only technology by which to manipulate genetic structure. The work that I currently do is focused on using viruses which contain the DNA of a normal sequence and try to use that to treat children who have an abnormal sequence of that DNA. So there's many ways of doing this, which are under investigation right now.
So really, from what you're saying, and I think a lot of the popular, not this, because what the popular literature is basically saying, we're really, even though the Watson Crick thing was from the 50s, we're really just at the beginning
Yes.
of what could possibly be an unbelievable revolution in genetic research and the implication of that. This is what you do. Could you speculate on what the possible implications could be for us as we get older? Because I'm sure people out there, one of the first things they're going to jump at is a dementia and Alzheimer's, because it's so epidemic. Is that even in the radar?
Yeah, it's a space that I'm not absolutely familiar with, but I would answer the question generally by saying that I agree with you with the term that you've used, the potential for revolutionary change. If you understand the biological basis for human disease, which, as we know, is enmeshed in this code of 4 nucleotides, as you appropriately said, CTAG, but that alphabet, if we understand the alphabet, how it's really manipulated to create disease A, B, C, or D, whether it's a preterm infant or someone who's of an older age, I think the limitations are endless. But I would also forewarn, at least from my perspective, we are just at the nascency of understanding gene therapy. And I use that term as the rubric for not just the work that I do, but really all the work that's based upon manipulating the DNA sequence. It's been heralded by tremendous success, but as you know, it's also been heralded by real transformative complications, right? Dating back to when Jesse Gelsinger, passed away, at the University of Pennsylvania in '93, when the first human gene therapy trial was done by James Wilson. So I think we have to have a healthy respect, but it's something that I refer to generically as the wild, wild west, because the potential is great, but I don't think yet we know how to do what God has crafted in life.
I'm sure you deal with this. I've come across it. There's got to be a lot of people who are saying, "Don't do this. This is you're now playing around with the very, very, very beginnings, the fundamental aspects of life that's in God's hands."
Yeah, I think it's a very important question that I think about spiritually as well. But in the context, to me, the differences are at what stage is one trying to intervene. If one has a child with a desperate, fatal, rare disease, I think that is a very different situation than playing, as you are proposing, God in utero, trying to put together a fetal, construction of what we feel is the right genes. So this has been done by the Chinese several years ago and created a major stir with embryo manipulation. And I think that is a dangerous component. But what I'm talking about is really therapeutic advances for disease that one knows prognostically relates to a certain genetic, sequence, and or in a disease which is manifested in a child, and hopefully before there's a fatal issue that becomes a result. So
Because
there's a
you
difference.
you do your a lot of your work is in a specific
Correct.
rare childhood
Correct.
disease, correct?
That is correct.
With the hope of through genetic therapy you'll find a cure.
Yeah, I think a cure is, I put in quotations. I think this is one of the issues that complicates the nature of our work because having taken care of children for the past 40 years with families who are desperate, every parent will do anything to try to save the life of their child. And I think that's something, it's a complicated situation because in early clinical trials of which we're doing, there's not the promise of cure. There's the promise of understanding how this therapy may eventually become a therapeutic advance in the management of a disease. But there's a big leap between stating it's a cure.
I know there are people who are actively working in university centers
Mhm.
around the country and probably around the world to try to get us to live longer.
Yes,
And they're working on these things at the end of called telomeres, if I'm pronouncing it
yes,
correctly,
yes.
where supposedly the secret of aging is. But there's also the reality, is there not, of we're I don't know whether the word prisoners or captives of our own genetic structure. That that's really true, isn't it?
I think that's a true statement. And, the whole aging question that you're asking about, there are other genes. People have looked at this for the role of apolipoprotein E genetic role, or ERCC6, which is a gene that is abnormal in a disease called progeria, and or Cockayne syndrome, which is a disease of DNA repair mechanism. So it's a fascinating space because in certain diseases like Cockayne syndrome or progeria, children will age decades within a year. They'll often pass away by 7 to 11 years of age and look like wizened old people. So, how this all impacts upon the aging process, I honestly have no clue.
No, I think that's. I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with you is I think it's people need to know that there's probably well, no, there's a difference between what's in the popular press or what's on the cover of a magazine to
Yes,
sell magazines
yes,
and what's really possible and really true now.
I agree.
And which leads me to the next question, because this is all over the place. Um, and that's this the promise of the new world through AI, through artificial intelligence. Talk to me a little bit about. I mean, how realistic is this? How frightening is this? Um, and if we get down into the weeds, is this just another tool that medicine can use to make life better or to enhance our own being?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. And I'm just learning about the utility or the concerns about artificial intelligence. The classic example is the Chat GPT systems that we're all familiar with in terms of how computers will necessarily act as a responder to your question using artificial intelligence. And the classic example or concern is that it's only as good as the data inputs that go into the framework of how to respond to the question, and is a very dangerous tool as well from a business perspective because it can also potentially contaminate confidential information. So businesses are very wary. I don't use it. I'm an old school individual, and I like to use books. I like to still read books, and I still read newspapers with paper, not electronic. Get my own mind working, but I do think it's going to be overused and potentially overutilized without the implications of understanding, particularly by young people, like in college. The old days of writing a thesis paper was you did the research. I have no idea how professors now are able to evaluate a student's intrinsic ability to write a thesis, for instance. So I think it's going to have great potential, as you say, for advancing knowledge, but I do have concerns about it, and I don't really use it at all, except in my personal life. I don't use it in my professional.
So we alluded to this a little bit before we went on, and I think it's a question I wanted to ask you to explore coming out of the scientific community. And that really is the nature of the march of science and how media and the public world has viewed this. And we get so much quote information, very little wisdom, but a lot of information, through phones or TikTok or whatever the heck it's called. Um, it's like, but we really don't understand a lot of the history. And you were alluding to the fact that perhaps as we step back at 30,000 feet and over the course of the next several years, we'll come to understand that the COVID pandemic, was really a watershed in how we view science and how we teach it and how we incorporate it into our life. Could you
Sure.
extrapolate on that?
Sure. I think that the pervasion of science in our community and maybe the mistrust of science, I do think has certain milestones. I think you cite an important one for the mistrust of the community, the way that the COVID vaccine and dissemination of vaccine requirements really did create some downstream impact. I think we're seeing that downstream impact from mistrust, especially in light of the measles epidemics that are going on in Texas and throughout other parts of the country, and through just vaccination fears. But vaccination fears have really been developing. That milestone of fear started decades ago when Andrew Wakefield brought up that the MMR vaccine could cause autism in a very hellaciously poorly written paper in Lancet, for which a very good friend of mine, Dr. Paul Offit from the Vaccine Education Center at CHUP, who's a well-known expert in this space, author of multiple books, one called The Vaccine Myth. The distrust of science has been going on for decades. You could say it's even gone further than that from certain racial groups after the Tuskegee Institute, in this incident with the mistrust of the African American community of science. So I think this is going on, just builds upon the mistrust. I think it's promulgated often also, as you very aptly say, by the way science is presented as somehow the cure to all ill. How long have we heard that cancer will be cured in our decade? I remember that when I was growing up, just learning about science. It was called the crab. Cancer was reflected as a crab. And I remember that we're going to cure cancer in 10 years. We're going to cure cancer in 20. As you really pointed out, there's so much we don't understand about science from a higher authority. I think we're chipping away at what I think spiritually God allows us to chip away at.
Do you see any dichotomy or the cooperation or the linkage between science and religion?
Well, I think they're intimately related. As a physician as I studied Jewish medical ethics a fair amount in my early part of my career, I realized that as a physician, when I cared for children at the most desperate moments, close to dying and then death, I realized that as a physician, I remember always referring to myself as a messenger of God's healing. And if the messenger of God's healing was allaying the dying of a child and allaying the suffering of a parent, then that was my job. And I sadly, but very graciously, thank God for the opportunity to try to ease those moments, as you would do as a spiritual leader in probably the same but different way. So I think the integration of science and religion is at levels that I know are well beyond my comprehension, but I believe I'm doing what I think is right. And I believe that research, I always comment that if it was supposed to be done the first time, it'd be called search. So research is a multitude of errors and mistakes and learning.
Well, remember the word in Hebrew for doctor is harofed, the healer. Um, and as you know, and as my colleagues know, and as probably some people listening or watching, it is possible to be spiritually healed,
Mm-hmm.
but not cured of a disease.
Yes, understand.
And that's one of the, and there is that element of mystery. I would suggest in both of the worlds in which we operate, um, there is a sense of awe and mystery as to this miracle, which is why we do the miracles of everyday existence in the prayer service every morning, because there is that element of it. Dr. Mulberg, are you optimistic about this nature of the research with genetics and in the future? Do you have hope?
Yeah, I do. I have more than hope. I begrudgingly say that when Zolgensma was approved as the first genetic therapy for children who die from something called spinal muscular atrophy, whose children I used to take care of, who died at 6 months of age because their breathing stopped, their muscles don't work. And when that therapy now allows children to run and play at 3 and 4 years of age and onward, that was the first success. In some ways, having a success first has set the standard so high that what we've seen have been some failures. And that's why I think it's very important to set the potential understanding that each individual respondent to gene therapy may not be the success that we all want it to be, but is a ladder by which we're climbing. But my hope and prayer for the future is absolutely we are making amazing progress with gene therapy. I think it's going to take a longer time to develop individual therapies depending on the nature of their disease. And that's something that is intrinsically well beyond our individual insights and why we need each other to try to learn from each other on that regard.
And you were, as we introduced, a rare disease drug developer. There's been a lot of information, not necessarily wisdom, I would imagine, but a lot of information in press about how drugs are handled. Do you think that there is, from your perspective, as really on the frontier of this, do we need to speed up the process of having the FDA drug accept drugs, or is the process really, with all the steps and trials, et cetera, is that the right way to go?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I could talk an hour on this topic alone, Rabbi Edros. I would say that understanding the history of the FDA, which most people do not know, I'm sure you do, but just to recapitulate it, the deaths of children developed the rules that are currently the statutory principles for the FDA. Elixir of sulfanilamide, the diphtheria toxoid deaths, and these are things that were done by charlatans, right? And in direct answer to your question, I think what has driven my whole career for the past 25 years has been trying to do what you've just asked. How do I expedite therapies for children? I'm a voice of children, and sadly, children don't have voice except by the adults that want to speak about their needs. And what you see is a burgeoning cry from parents through every individual rare disease that is desperate for a treatment. The FDA develops and approves therapy based upon statutory principles. But I've been intimately involved in my past using a statutory principle, what's called regulatory flexibility. And that allows the FDA, based on the evidentiary basis that's submitted to them, to make decisions. And I think that's the right way of allowing drugs and biologics and gene therapies to be approved, not by people on top as secretaries of this or that, or FDA commissioners, to autocratically say we should just let the gates open. I think we don't want the gates to open without proper review and scientific oversight.
Wow, thank you. Yes. Because they're actually, as you pointed out and as you've developed your career, they're real live people whose
Yes.
lives depend upon what you do.
Yes.
Um, Dr. Andrew Mulberg, thank you very, very much.
Thank
I'm
you.
very grateful for your time. I know you're real busy, but continued success
Thank you.
in this journey that you're on, and because you're saving lives. And thank you very, very much. Take care. Just stay safe.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
To all of you, thank you very much for joining us today on today's edition of Seekers of Meaning, the podcast TV arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. Again, if you'd like to make a comment on the show or suggestion, please feel free to email me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. If you know of a company or an individual or group that would like to sponsor some of these podcasts, please also just email me and we'll take it from there. We appreciate your support. On the website, jewishsacredaging.com, you'll find a very conveniently located donate button, and we would appreciate any support you have. Seekers of Meaning is produced at the broadcast centers of Lubetkin Media Company in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and a big thank you, as usual, to our producer, Steve Lubetkin. Again, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate your time. We know you're very, very busy, and we thank you very much for joining us. Until we see each other again on the next Seekers of Meaning, take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay well, and most of all, be kind to one another. Todah Shalom.